Thank you, Matt and Pauline, for helping us thus far. Friends, if you have your Bibles, please have it open at both Hebrews 11 very briefly, but also mainly at Judges 4, where we'll spend most of our time this evening as we look at this man Barak. But let's just begin with Hebrews 11:32, which is where we've got to in our series. Hebrews 11:32, what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight, and much more besides, as we'll see in some coming weeks. I wonder if you would like to maybe know, or you'd like to take a guess at how many people are named in the Bible. How many different names there are. Just think about it for a moment. There's a lot, okay? I haven't counted them. I don't know for sure. But I have read and calculated estimates that range between 1,500 and 3,000. And 3,000 wouldn't surprise me if that was true. Now, just supposing I was to ask you to write down the names of 50 people in the Bible that come to your mind. You could probably draw up a list of 50, I would think. Some of you at a stretch could probably list 100. But if I was a betting man, which I'm not, I'd be fairly certain, if I was to say to you, that either out of your 50 or out of your 100, at least prior to this weekend, Barak would not be among them. He's not exactly one of the best known characters in the Bible. And so I find it interesting, we've been going through Hebrews 11 over these past weeks and months. We've seen a whole range of different characters, haven't we? Some better known than others, but Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham and Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph and Moses, and each one of them is included here because the writer wants to teach us something different about what faith looks like, what faith is. And the underlying principle is the same in all of these people's lives. It's all about their response to something that God revealed to them. And as I said numerous times, and bear with me if I say it again, faith is not something that starts with me, that I conjure or work up. Faith is how I respond to something that God says to me. Now, as he draws towards the close of this great chapter, he becomes much more general in his examples. Instead of giving us a lot of information about these characters, he just names them. And I think the reason for that is, having established the great principle of faith, now he just mentions a few names, only 6 specific names mentioned here, without giving any more details, probably because by now we should be able to work out the lessons. And also remembering too that this letter was first of all written to people from a primarily Jewish background, they would know all about Barak and all the other names. So immediately his name is mentioned and read, they would begin to be able to put 2 and 2 together and work out the stories. Then after the 6th here, he doesn't even mention names. He just nameless examples he gives us. And he moves on through history. So he goes through the period of the judges with Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and Samuel, then into the monarchy with David, and then, without mentioning names, into the prophets. And when we initially planned the series in Hebrews 11, I thought we'd just take these last verses from 32 onwards, maybe in 2 or 3 studies. But then I thought, no, there's some value in unpacking some of these lives that are not perhaps so well known to us, and learning lessons. Last week, Matt helped me remind us of the life of Gideon and introduce us to the period of the judges. And so tonight we're looking at Barak because he comes next in the list, although chronologically he actually comes before Gideon. Interestingly, Barak wasn't a judge, although he lived at the time of the judges, and I suspect he's the least well-known of all the names mentioned to us in Hebrews 11. But for that reason, I'm glad he's included. It's a reminder that all men and women of faith were not strong, gung-ho, go-get-them sort of attitude. We encounter here, as we did with Gideon, a man who is quite reluctant, who takes on the task given to him with a certain amount of lacking of confidence. And we're also reminded that the great heroes of the faith are not names up in lights. They're the very ordinary people. And when you think about it, the Church of Jesus Christ, down through the years, is the overwhelming majority of them are not named. The great heroes of the faith, all through the generations, in some ways have been the exceptions. They're the ones, the names that we know. But for every one of them, there's probably 1,000 or 10,000 anonymous saints of God who in their everyday life situations are plodding away and working out faith in their own lives. So take heart, my friends. We live in a day of celebrities, even within the Church of Jesus Christ. The world is obsessed with celebrities. The church is obsessed with celebrities. God isn't obsessed with celebrities. God just wants faithful men and women who are pegging away faithfully. And it may be that nobody outside your family and God will ever knew you existed. But God knew. And God noted. And God commended your faith. So we're going to look at Barak. I will just take a moment also. Let's go back to Judges. And I want to take a moment to set the scene for what's going on, because it's important as we look at the story of Barak and indeed Samson and Jephthah over the coming weeks. For 300 years after the death of Joshua, God left Israel without a national leader. So he raised up a series of what we call judges. Now, when you think of a judge, you probably think of somebody with a white wig sitting in a court. That's not the sort of judge we're talking about here. It was a mixture of civil and military authority. And they tend to be over one area of the country rather than over the nation as a whole. And they were needed because of the trouble caused by the Canaanite tribes that God's people had failed to clear out of the land when they invaded under Joshua's leadership. And so these remaining pockets of resistance became a constant problem to them, and were used by God both to punish and discipline them, but also to test them. If you come back to Judges chapter 3, for example, excuse me, to Judges chapter 3, it says, "These are the nations that the Lord left to test Israel by them, that is, all in Israel who had not experienced all the wars in Canaan. It was only in order that the generations of the people of Israel might know war, to teach war to those who had not known it before. These are the nations, the 5 lords of the Philistines, and all the Canaanites, and the Sidonians, and the Hivites who lived on Mount Lebanon, from Mount Baal Hermon as far as Lebo Hamath. They were for the testing of Israel, to know whether Israel would obey the commandments of the Lord, which he commanded their fathers by the hand of Moses. So the people of Israel lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And their daughters they took to themselves for wives, and their own daughters they gave to their sons." And then you get this very ominous phrase, "and they served their gods." And that sets the scene, really, the tone, for generations of Israelites to come. Because they had failed to clear these nations out of the land that God had given them, they became mixed and compromised with them and served their gods. Often not instead of Yahweh, but as well as Yahweh. And so what happened, and Matt pointed this out very helpfully for us last week, what happened was there was a series of repeated cycles of rebellion, where the people practiced idolatry and various other sins against God, so as it were, they forget about God, and they rebelled against God, and so God disciplined them. So rebellion was followed by a period of retribution, when God brought in one of these other tribes, or even somebody from further afield, and they harassed them and oppressed them for a period of time as an act of discipline by God. And then as they smarted under that oppression, they cried out to God for help, and God came and delivered them by raising up a judge. And this judge helped deliver them and clear the land again. And then we're told that the land had rest. So if you come to chapter 3, just before we pick it up this evening, chapter 3 and verse 30, under the judgeship of Ehud, Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest for 80 years. And there's a very brief reference to a guy called Shamgar, and then the cycle begins again in chapter 4. Notice, the people of Israel again, that's the word, again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. So the cycle's beginning all over again. Now Barak comes about 50 to 60 years before the story of Gideon, whose problem was the Midianites. In Barak's time, as we read tonight, the problem is Jabin, one of the Canaanite kings. He's actually mentioned 5 times in this chapter, but he himself never appears. And we just understand the background here just a little bit. We know from Joshua 12 that the land of Canaan was made up of a number of we might call them city-states, each of them ruled by a king. And Jabin was probably an official title rather than the guy's real name. Probably the title of the king of Hazor. Because, again, the book of Joshua tells us that in his day, and we're talking 150 years previous, Joshua killed Jabin, the king of Hazor. So this is clearly one of Jabin's successors, who's known, a bit like Pharaoh of Egypt. It's not his name, it's his title. So this is another Jabin, a successor of the Jabin in Joshua's day. And Judges 4:2 here describes as king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor, which probably means he was the head of a confederacy of kings. He was the king of Hazor, but he was probably the first of a number of kings, the supreme king of a number of kings in most of that particular land. Joshua again tells us in chapter 11 that the Israelites had burned the city of Hazor to the ground, but the Canaanites had rebuilt it and occupied it. So here we are, 150 years later, they've rebuilt the city, they've become a potent force again, and there's another king called Jabin on the throne. But the real confrontation is not with Jabin, it's with Jabin's general, whose name is Sisera, that we have here. And he's particularly notorious, we're told here, because in verse 3, he had 900 chariots of iron. That means he was wealthy, he was well armed, and he had a large army. This is just a chariot. He would have had horsemen and soldiers and all the rest of it. He's a powerful, wealthy king. At this period, we're told in verse 3, this period of oppression under Jabin lasted for 20 years. So for 20 years, God allows this nation, he raises up this group of Canaanites to harass and to oppress his people because of their sin. Now again, before we look at the story and the lessons, and before we look at Barak himself, we also need to notice something else very important here. The judge at this time was not Barak. The judge at this time, unusually, indeed uniquely, was a woman called Deborah. Now, in a male-led society like the Hebrews, that was quite remarkable. It's also an indication to us, and we know this from elsewhere in Scripture, from other references, it's an indication of how bad things were spiritually. And please don't take this in some sort of chauvinistic sense. How bad things were when a nation was being led by a woman, because apparently there were no godly men around. That's the impression that we've been given. We're told, I think it's in Isaiah, that one of the marks of the wickedness of God's people is they're being led by women. So Deborah here is a woman judge, not Barak the judge. And she's also one of two key female players in this story, the other being Jael, who we meet, of course, at the end of the story. So let me set the scene. Let me take you through this story and learn some of the lessons before we look at Barak himself and what we learn from him. So for 20 years, God has used these Canaanites, ruled by Jabin, to harass and oppress his own people to discipline. Please notice the note of sovereignty, the stress on the sovereignty of God. Look at verse 2. The Lord, Yahweh, sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan. This didn't just happen by accident. It wasn't just a military strategy. God gave them up. Because of their disobedience, because of their idolatry, because of their unbelief and rebellion, God handed them over to a pagan king, basically to do what he liked with them, because of punishment. That's what God does, even with his own people sometimes. We know that from Romans. We know that from about creation. That when people choose sin over God, when people choose the creature over the Creator, God gives them up to the desire of their own hearts. We know that he sometimes does that with his own people, to discipline them, to make them realize what they're missing, to make them realize what they're losing. So God gives them up to Jabin and his forces. And when the people repented and cried for help, God raised up Deborah, a prophetess, as well as a judge, according to verse 4. And what Deborah does is she summons Barak, obviously a military commander, and tells him that God is going to deliver the people from Jabin and Sisera, and that he, Barak, is to mobilize 10,000 soldiers to fight against the Canaanites at a very specific location by the river Kishon. Verse 7. And we'll see the significance of that in a few moments' time. And he's given a very specific promise. Verse 7. I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the river Kishon with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand. He's promised success. He's promised, he's guaranteed that his endeavors will be successful. Barak says, well, I'm only going to do this, Deborah, if you accompany me. Which she does. And she says that Sisera will die, not in Barak's battle, but at the hands of a woman. And at this moment in the story, we assume, of course, not knowing the end of the story, as we now do, that what she means is, well, if you're only going to come because I'm going to lead, then I will get the victory, I will get the credit for the death of Sisera. Now we know, of course, we get in the chapter, that's not actually what happens. So battle is joined. Look at verse 12. When Sisera was told that Barak, the son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor, Sisera called out all his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the men who were with him, from Harosheth Hagoyim to the river Kishon. And Deborah said to Barak, "Up, for this is the day in which the Lord has given Sisera into your hand. Does not the Lord go out before you?" So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. And the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots, and all his army before Barak by the edge of his sword. And Sisera got down from his chariot and fled away on foot. And Barak pursued the chariots and the army to Harosheth Hagoyim, and all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword. Not a man was left. We missed out one verse, which I think is actually quite significant in the story here. Verse 11. Heber the Kenite, or the Kenite, has separated from the Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, and had pitched his tent as far away as the oak in Zananim, which is near Kedesh. Now, one of the ways that Hebrew writes history is they put little appetizers, if you like, ahead of where it's going to become relevant. So a little later in the story, of course, verse 17, we discover that Sisera, when he runs away, goes to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, who we just read about in verse 11, because there's peace between these two houses. Now, I'm going to just use my imagination for a little bit. Why is the writer of Hebrews telling us this in verse 11 to prepare us for something that's going to come down the line? Because we need to understand that the Kenites were not Israelites, they were very distant cousins. They were descended from Moses' father-in-law, but they're from a pagan background. And therefore it's quite surprising to me that Jael, this Kenite woman, was the one who brought about the death of Sisera, the great enemy of the Israelites. Let me make a little suggestion to you why the Hebrew writers put it this way. We're told in verse 12, when Sisera was told that Barak had gone up to Mount Tabor, I wonder who told him. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us, but I want to put a little idea in your head. I wonder if Heber the Kenite told him. And I wonder if Heber the Kenite told him not to warn him, but to trap him. You see, when Sisera in a few moments turns up at Jael's tent and she kills him, that's not a sort of momentary, spontaneous act. It's almost as if they've been waiting for an opportunity to align themselves with the Hebrews in some particular way. Now, that's not spelled out for us in the scriptures, but it would account for why the Hebrew writer puts this little bit in verse 11. And then says in verse 12, when Sisera was told that Barak had gone up to Mount Tabor, we're meant to see, well, hang on a minute, maybe it was Heber who told him. And maybe Heber told him not to warn him, but to entrap him, to bring him into a trap. We don't know. But I'm just throwing that out to try and give you maybe a different angle on this particular story. So battle is joined, and the Lord routs Sisera's army, and Sisera escapes by foot, while every one of his soldiers killed. Notice that, the comprehensive nature of this. You see, if it is said in verse 16, all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword, if that's where the sentence finished, we might have thought this is a legitimate hyperbole. Almost, just seemed like they'd all killed. But there'd be a few stragglers who got saved. But no, not a man was left. That's very specific, isn't it? This is a comprehensive victory. The only one who's escaped is Sisera. We know that. Now we need to just take a moment to look at chapter 5, not in great detail. Chapter 5 is a song composed and sung by Deborah and Barak to celebrate this great victory. And because it's poetic and it's got this song element, it tells us one or two very interesting bits of detail about the battle in chapter 4. So come with me to chapter 5 for a moment and look at verse 19. This is Deborah's song about the battle. It's very similar, by the way, and you'll see another connection in a moment, in Exodus 14, where the people of Israel cross the Red Sea, and then the Pharaoh and all his army is destroyed in the river. Look that, in a river. Chapter 15, there's a song of Moses, in which he celebrates that great victory. So here in chapter 14 we have a battle, in chapter 15 we have a song celebrating that battle. Look at verse 19. The kings came, they fought, then fought the kings of Canaan at Tanakh by the waters of Megiddo. They got no spoils of silver. From heaven the stars fought. From their courses they fought against Sisera. The torrent Kishon swept them away. The ancient torrent, the torrent Kishon. March on, my soul, with might. What's Deborah telling us? She's telling us that as Barak engaged the forces of Sisera, God came to their aid. God came to their aid in a very specific way. There was a divine intervention. It would seem from Deborah's language that the Lord sent a fierce thunderstorm, a fierce rainstorm that made the Kishon River overflow and turn the battlefield into a sea of mud. And Sisera's most powerful weapon, which was his chariots of iron, would not do very well in a mud bath. Which also tells us that this probably happened in a dry season when the rivers would normally have dried up in that part of the world. So when Jabin is thinking about his battle and Sisera and his strategy, they said, well, we'll take our chariots of iron because they're going to stand us in good stead here. He didn't think for a moment there's going to be a massive rainstorm and his chariots of iron are going to get bogged down into a sea of mud. That would impede the mobility of the chariots and the horses. It would make it easy for the Israelites to attack and slaughter the army. And the trap worked. And the enemy was wiped out. And there's another interesting reason why I think that's the right interpretation. Judges 4:15 tells us that the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots. That word routed is exactly the same word in the Hebrew as the word that's used in Exodus 14 at the Red Sea when God sent Pharaoh's chariots into confusion. Exodus ESV says he sent them into confusion. The Hebrew word is the same word as here. He routed them. And that idea of routed is not just a comprehensive defeat. It's they were all over the place. There were sixes and sevens. They couldn't make out what was going on. And why would they? In Pharaoh's day, they'd just seen 2 million people cross the Red Sea. We couldn't do that. And they were confused when it didn't happen. So here, Jabin turns up, or Sisera turns up with his 900 chariots of iron, thinking we've got this in the basket. Because only to find that God has other plans for them. And so Sisera runs away to the home of a friend and an ally, Heber the Kenite, not an Israelite, though descended from Moses' father-in-law. Heber is not at home, but his wife Jael is at home. And she welcomes Sisera into the family tent. She gives him hospitality. And then if you have a nervous disposition, just close your ears for a moment or two. She takes a tent peg and she drives it straight through his skull into the ground. It's quite interesting. The nomadic tribes in the east, and I found a number of these in my travels in Africa as well, it was the women who took down and put up the tents as they travelled around. So Jael had wielded a hammer and a tent peg many, many times, but not quite in the same way, I presume, if she did on this particular occasion. But it's not surprising in that sense that it's a woman who did it, because of the women who used the hammer and the tent pegs. And when Barak arrives on the scene, he discovers that his enemy is dead, and that Deborah's prediction has been fulfilled. Sisera will die at the hands of a woman. Now just think about Sisera for a moment. For a military captain to flee from a battle was embarrassing. For him to be killed while fleeing was humiliating. But to be killed by a woman was the most disgraceful thing of all. There's a story that comes to mind, I can't think of its precise reference, I think it's in the days of the kings, where one of the kings is seriously wounded in a battle and says to his armor bearer, as it were, run me through, because if you don't kill me, that woman's going to kill me. And that would be the ultimate ignominy form of the king. So just as Deborah prophesied, Sisera is killed by the hand of a woman, who in doing so, and we need to bear this in mind, who in doing so breaks all the customs and conventions of hospitality. She also breaks several commandments of God about murder. But of course she wasn't an Israelite. We also need to remember just for a moment that, to get the whole story, the Jews had been under terrible bondage because of Jabin and Sisera for many years. And it was God's will that they be delivered. And God, being God, can use whoever to do it. For example, if the Canaanite army had won the battle, terrible atrocities would have taken place among the Hebrew people. There's a little interesting reference in Judges chapter 5, at the end of Deborah's song. To get the picture, verse 28, out of the window she peered, the mother of Sisera wailed from the lattice. So she's picturing Sisera's mother waiting for him to come back. Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why tarry the hoofbeats of his chariots? Her wisest princesses answer. Indeed, she answers herself. Have they not found and divided the spoil? Notice his next phrase, a womb or two for every man. In other words, what they're saying is the reason Sisera has not yet come back is because they're enjoying the spoils of war, including the rape of the Hebrew women. So if God does not win the victory for the Hebrew people, the appalling brutality and cruelty of the Canaanites would continue against his own covenant people. As God, sovereign as he is, he uses this woman Jael for whatever motivation to actually bring about the end of Sisera and set free Israel. So for Jael, you see, there's a war on. And this courageous woman finally, I think, stopped being neutral and took her stand with the people of God. I think to some extent along with her husband, as I mentioned earlier. And so through this act of betrayal, God brings to an end the oppression of the Canaanites against his people. Friends, there are some people who say the Bible is boring. They've obviously not read Judges 4 and 5 apart from anything else. And I wanted to take the time to take you through that, to show you the different elements of it. It's not just a straight story. God is at work in all these different ways, all sorts of different levels to it. But our study this evening is drawn from Hebrews 11:32, the name of Barak. So knowing the story well now, I hope, we need to consider, why does Barak's name appear in the list of heroes of faith in Hebrews 11? After all, as we read the story, he's not the main player. Deborah maybe is the main player. Or even Jael is the main player. Why Barak? It's interesting when the inspired writer of Hebrews looks back. Remember what he's doing in Hebrews 11? He's trying to give examples of his teaching in the last verse of chapter 10. We are not those who shrink back. We are those who persevere, as by all these examples. And when he's thinking of all these examples, he thinks of Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham, yes. And he thinks of Moses, absolutely. And he thinks of Gideon, but Barak? Where did he get that one from? Why not choose Deborah? Why not even Jael? Especially when you remember what Barak said. We need to go back to verses 8 and 9 particularly. Here's Barak's response to Deborah's commissioning for war. If you will go with me, I will go, but if you will not go with me, I will not go. That doesn't sound like a manly, strong military commander, does it? He says to this woman, I'll go if you take me, I'll go if you come with me. Friends, it's a good example of a vitally important principle of reading Scripture. We must always compare Scripture with Scripture. See, if we only had the judge's account of Barak, we might come to the conclusion he's a bit of a wimp. He's hiding behind Deborah's skirts, as it were. But Hebrews 11 says that overall Barak was a man of faith. That he lived by faith. He exercised faith. So we need to be very careful how we understand his character. Let me give you another example of this principle. Not directly to do with this story. Think of Jacob. Jacob and Esau. And Jacob's a twister, he's a deceiver. He's always up to every trick in the book, isn't he? I may have said this before. I tend to think of Jacob a bit like Del Boy. You know Del Boy. Some people know Del Boy. Not sure how old you are, apart from anything else. Probably the best comedy series BBC ever showed in all history. Still funny and relevant today. He was up to every trick in the book, it would seem. But Jacob is in Hebrews 11. When God thinks of Jacob, he doesn't think of him as a Del Boy, he thinks of him as a man of faith. And it's actually interesting, you go back and you read Jacob's life in the light of that statement. It's not saying that Jacob always made the right decision, always made the right call, but the general overall trajectory of his life was a man who trusted God. We need to be careful how we understand Scripture. We must always read it in sympathy with another part of Scripture. So what do we make of Barak? Well, how does anybody live by faith? Well, we know the answer to that by now, I hope by this statement in Hebrews 11. Somebody who lives by faith hears God speak, believes what God says, and does it. That's it. Hear God speak, believe what God says, and does it. Well, let's look at the evidence as it relates to Barak. Again, go back to chapter 4, particularly from verse 4 onwards. We'll read it again, which you have in front of you. We read it earlier. Deborah is God's appointed leader of the people of Israel at this time. And not only, please notice this, not only is she raised up by God as a judge, but she is a prophetess. She communicates to Barak in the very name of God. Verse 6. She sends to summon Barak and says, has not the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you? And then this is not her speaking, this is her speaking the words of God. Here's what God has commanded Barak. Go, gather your men at Mount Tabor, taking 10,000 of the people of Naphtali and the people of Zebulun, and I, God, not Deborah, I, God, will draw out Sisera. And I, God, not Deborah, I will give him into your hand. You see this? This is God speaking. Through his appointed mouthpiece, Deborah, the prophetess, and the judge. Very specific instructions. She tells Barak the location, she tells him the number of soldiers, she tells him from which tribes he's to bring them, she tells him the strategy God will use, that if you get these men ready, I will draw out Sisera. I will get him to know that this is going to happen, and he'll think he's walking into a victory where actually he's walking into a trap. I will give him into your hand. And her words are identified with God's word. That's what gives her authority. The prophetess, or the prophet of course, does not speak her own mind. She speaks God's word. God tells her what to say. And we've no reason to doubt that Deborah is a true prophetess. There are many false prophets around. Deborah is communicated as a true prophetess. So she speaks it, what God says, to the people, including Barak. So it's not really Deborah telling Barak what to do. It's God himself. So the first criteria has been met. Barak has heard the voice of God. Secondly, having heard the word of God, you have to believe it to be true, which if it is the word of God will always be the case, of course, and act on it. And friends, notice, Barak does not argue with Deborah. He doesn't say, Deborah, I don't believe you. He doesn't say, Deborah, you've got it wrong. You've heard wrong what God has said. He accepts what she says to be true. Otherwise, he wouldn't agree to go with it, albeit with certain conditions. You understand this? He's willing to fight. He's willing to go. He just accepts and admits his own weakness, his own insufficiency. When I read Barak's words here, I can't help but recall Moses' words to God. Do you remember back in Exodus 33. Remember after the terrible judgment of God after the golden calf incident, many Hebrew people put to death. And God says to Moses, Moses, leave this place. Go with this people. Get on the way. But I am not going with you. And Moses says to God, if you do not go with us, don't send us. That's not very dissimilar from what Barak is saying here. I'm not prepared to go unless you, Deborah, not just Deborah the woman, not even just Deborah the prophetess, but Deborah the judge, God's representative. I'll go. In effect, he's saying, I'll go if you, God, go with me. God, I'll do as you say, but only if I know that you're with me. Friends, that's not disobedience. That's faith, isn't it? It's cautious faith. It may be weak faith, but it's still faith. See, disobedience, in Moses' case, is what he did back in Exodus chapter 3. When he met God with the burning bush, you remember, and he had a long argument. It's one of the longest chapters in Exodus. A long argument with God as he tries to wriggle out of the commission God's given. He's trying to find every excuse he can under the sun. Barak is not being disobedient. He's just being honest. He's expressing his weakness. He's expressing his need of reassurance. It's a little bit like Gideon last week asking for reassurance through the fleece. Lord, I trust you, but I need a sign. My faith is weak. In fact, so weak is my faith, I need two signs. Reverse the first one just to make sure I understand this. And Barak gets that reassurance. 3 times we read, and this is why this is important. 3 times we read, I will go, he says. And Deborah arose and went, and Deborah went up with him. But notice also verse 14 of chapter 4. Deborah said to Barak, up, for this is the day in which the Lord has given Sisera into your hand. Does not the Lord go out before you? God's with you. You've taken the first steps of faith. You've called the soldiers. They're rallying. Sisera is on his way. God is with you. Because Barak, even with his weak, insufficient faith, has taken those steps of obedience. Deborah has gone with him physically, but when Deborah is going, God is going with him. Now Deborah is saying with confidence, God has gone before you here. Friends, I'm so glad that Barak is included among the great heroes of the faith. Not some dynamic, strong, go-getting character, but a man who's very conscious of his own weakness and his need and his willingness to do whatever God wants him to do as long as God goes with him. In this case, it's through his appointed representative. We've always got to stop seeing Deborah and see God. It's God speaking through Deborah. It's God going through Deborah. It's cautious faith, but it's still faith, isn't it? He's not saying no. He's not refusing. He's just saying, God, help me. Help me. It may need some reassurance, it may need some hand-holding, but it's still faith nonetheless. Friends, I don't know about you, but I can identify with that better than with Abraham or Moses. God, I hear what you're saying. I know what I should do. I believe you. I trust you. But you know, just hold my hand. Just come with me. Give me that sense that you're in this and that you're with me. Don't you feel like that sometimes? It's cautious faith. It's maybe weak faith. But it's still faith, nonetheless. So, I spent about 15 years working with an international missionary agency in a leadership role. And one of the great joys of that job was that many, many times I sat down and interviewed people who were applying to join us so they could go and work in different parts of Africa. And it was a very special time when people share some really personal journeys that they've been through with you. And sometimes you're wondering, is God really in this? And we turned down several people in my time because they were good people, talented, qualified in what they were doing, but we weren't absolutely convinced this was God's call on their life. They were responding to a need, genuinely and from a heart, but we weren't sure God was in this. There were other times when it was patently clear. Do you know the times I was most convinced that God was in this? It was when people said to me, I've been fighting this for the last 10 years, and I want to give up fighting now. These are the people who said, I can't wait to get out there. These are the people who said, God spoke to me on Saturday, and here is Monday, I'm here in your office, give me a ticket. Those are the people I'm nervous about. But the people I was almost in reflex convinced about was the people who said, John, I've been fighting this for 10 years, but I've given up fighting. They're the barracks of this world. Okay, God, I give in, I'll go. But I'm only going to do it because I think you're going to go with me. See, but the Bible commends Barak and these other guys for their faith. It doesn't commend them because they had huge faith. It just commended them because they had faith. And I find it so encouraging. Even Jesus says, if your faith, what? Small as a mustard seed. Small as a mustard seed. Because the secret of success, my friends, is not in the amount of our faith. It's in the one in whom our faith is placed. We went there previously, haven't we, in Hebrews 11. If you've got small faith, but a big God, no problems. If you've got big faith, and a small God or a non-existent God, then your big faith is useless to you. So you may feel this today, I've got a very small faith. My trust in God is so small. But friends, I want you to take your eye off your faith, and I want you to put your eye on the object of your faith, God. And maybe God is saying something to you, has been over a period of time, telling you to do something, showing you some new direction He wants you to take, whatever else it may be. And I was thinking this evening, what are all sorts of scenarios we can imagine? But no, I'm not going to even go there, because they're limitless in their possibilities. And you've been holding back perhaps, or reluctant, or whatever else, because you just don't know whether you're up for it. But my friends, if God has called you, you are up for it. Because with God's calling always comes God's competency. He will never call you to do something that with His power and strength you cannot accomplish. Never. God is not setting you up for a fall. God is setting you up for your faith. And it may be weak and say, okay, God, I'll do it, but oh, you better hold my hand the whole way. Well, join the crowd. That's what Barak did. And God honoured him. And although so many people's names are forgotten, Barak's name lives on in the record of Hebrews 11. Deborah's name's not in Hebrews 11. Barak's name is. Because he trusted in God. So my friends, I want to encourage you tonight. I want to encourage myself. It doesn't really matter how small our faith is. As long as it's there, what really matters is the God in whom our faith is placed. Let's pray. Father, there are so many times when we read the scriptures and we read of some of the great men and women whose lives are told us, and we recoil sometimes because we think that could never be us. We're so grateful that your word also includes what we might describe as the very ordinary, the weak, men like Barak. Thank you for this man, Lord. He wasn't interested in getting the glory and the credit. When Deborah says, well, if that's your condition, then you won't get the glory and the honour for doing this. Barak couldn't care less about that, as long as the job is done. He just wants to be an obedient servant. He doesn't want his name written up there in lights. He would have been probably the last one to even imagine that 3,000 years later or so, we're talking about it here tonight. Because your Holy Spirit has recorded his name for us. Thank you for the countless, almost anonymous Baraks that have made up the history of the church. And Father, I want to pray that you will inspire us through this very ordinary man's example. And teach us that wherever you call us to go, whatever you call us to do, all you require from us is willing obedience. And you promise us that you will go with us. So our prayer is that as you take us into a new day, into a new week, into a new adventure perhaps. Perhaps this week you're going to bring a real challenge to us. Perhaps you're already challenging some of us here tonight with some new venture, some new step of faith, some new act of obedience. And all you're asking for is, I'll do it. I'll go. And I believe, Lord, you welcome that humble dependency. Lord, I will go, I will do it. But boy, I need you right beside me every step of the way. And thank you that you've given us that, because you've put within our hearts the Holy Spirit, who accompanies us, keeps us, and protects us. So thank you for this amazing story in the book of Judges. May we live in the light of it and learn its lessons. For we ask it in Jesus' name and for his sake. Amen.